What the heck is a whole brand? A whole brand is nimble, intentional, and empathetic organization that sees everything it does as the brand and is guided and inspired by a core idea, what we call a red thread, inside and out, from business ideas to marketing ideas and all the ideas in between. It does what it says and says what it does. So both employees and customers are telling the same story. And whole brands measure success in 3 important ways: by profit, performance, and its impact on people, communities, and the planet, outperforming their fractured counterparts by upwards of 40%. And that's a whole brand.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lindsay DeWitt, EVP of Barkley's Purpose and Sustainability Practice, and I'm so thrilled to welcome you to today's event, launching our 2022 State of the Whole Brand Report. Like our report, we see today as a way to shed light on the power of whole brands. You're going to hear some highlights from our research, as well as thoughts from other whole brand thinkers outside of Barkley. Our guest panelists have their own unique view on brands, and so we're so thrilled to have them joining us today. And we're so glad you could join us to learn from them. But first, a quick word about Barkley and the Whole Brand Project. Barkley is an independent creative idea company with offices in Kansas City, New York, Pittsburgh, and Denver. At Barkley, we build whole brands, starting with our own. Last year, Barkley became the largest independent agency to become a certified B Corporation, proof that it's possible to balance purpose with profit. And we believe so strongly in this approach that we have been growing an entire practice to help other brands do the exact same. Today's event comes from our Whole Brand Project, which is our proactive lab and think tank with a mission of building a world with more whole brands. In order to know how to build whole brands that the world truly needs, the project creates primary research, experiments, and also content to share with you and with others and inspire you in your leadership and whole brand building journey. A core part of our approach to building whole brands is a dedication to knowing the modern consumer better than anyone. More than 10 years ago, actually, Barkley was the first company to launch major research in collaboration with the Boston Consulting Group to study millennials and then later Gen Z. That research led us to publish 6 books and a whole host of exciting collaborations. And we're just starting our latest book, centered on whole brands. But today, we are here to understand the state of whole brands and how you can build one right now. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce you to one of our report's contributors and an innovation specialist, Barkley's SVP of Strategy, Andy Woolard. Take it away, Andy.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Hi, everybody. As you heard, we build whole brands. The language that we choose tends to create a reality, so we find it necessary to start any of our presentations on whole brands with a quick definition of a whole brand. So a whole brand is an organization that sees everything it does as the brand, from marketing ideas to advertising ideas, product and service design, content, PR, everything in between. In addition, whole brands practice what they preach. So what they say and do inside matches what they say and do outside. They have a core idea that guides and inspires everything they do, everything. And most importantly, they measure success by combining profit, performance, and their impact on people, community, and the planet. So why whole brands? Because this is really how people actually see and experience the brands that they interact with. They don't just think in terms of logos and ads. People have a memory inside their heads based on the collected experiences that they have had with the brand. So for all of us on the call right now, Nike may feel different. The experience you have at IKEA is likely different from each other. How you experience Patagonia, each one of us experiences that brand differently because each of us has a collection of different experiences that go along with that brand. That's what makes this so exciting. And the model that we use, we apply creativity really to everything that a brand does. because every action a brand takes is one more reason to choose that brand, or maybe not to choose that brand. So whole brands ultimately become very good at everything inside and out. Which brings me to this year's State of the Whole Brand report. This year, we surveyed more than 5,000 consumers and looked at more than 150 different brands and asked people to answer questions about their perceptions of the brands based on a spectrum of actions like marketing, customer experience, design, purpose. In the report, you're going to find category leaders plus a special section that highlights what we call 3-star brands. These are brands that went above and beyond the rest of the pack. I like to think of these as kind of what we call Michelin 3-star restaurants, right? They go beyond great. They achieve that element of specialness really in everything they do. Our report doesn't stop there. In addition, we bring in other whole brand thinkers and contributors to share how they're building whole brands right now and their perspective on what it takes to make a truly whole brand. So that's next. We want to hear from some of these thinkers and get into our panel discussion with Barkley's Chief Idea Officer and Director of the Whole Brand Project, Mr. Tim Gallis.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you everybody for joining us. This is the third year that we've done our State of the Whole Brand study and report, and this is the first time that we've done it live. So really excited to make this a live presentation and hear from really great whole brand thinkers. Over those years, we've really talked to over 13,000 consumers now. We've studied over 220 different brands in about 30 different categories. But what's really interesting this year is there's been a new urgency to the idea. And it goes beyond the urgency that we've all experienced over the last 2.5 years. It's not just what we've all been dealing with in the country and around the world in business, but there's an urgency that's driving this report because we have found now through our study, which is really derives our whole brand index, that we can now predict 70% of a brand's market performance. I want to kind of repeat that because it's a really high percentage. We can now predict how well a brand will do in market performance because of this whole brand index at a rate of 70%. And that's really high. And we're really proud of that, but that's really where a lot of this urgency comes from. So we want to get this message out. If our mission is really to build whole brands, the faster and sooner we can get this out, the better. But as you know, data is just one piece of it. It really comes down to great storytelling. So we see no more appropriate way than to launch our report by sharing this space with 3 great storytellers who have also been great partners and contributors to the project. So I'm excited and proud to be joined by the prolific whole brand thinker and builder, Eric Ryan, founder of Method, OLLY, Welly, and his latest brand, Cast.
And hopefully more to come.
Yeah, more to come. And we also have Steph Wissink, a long friend of the project and an incredible brand provocateur. And Steph is managing director of consumer research at Jefferies. And then last but not least, one of my biggest inspirations, the always creative and strategic and very straightforward Heidi Hackemer. Heidi's the executive director of the newly formed Oatly Climate and Culture Lab. So without further ado, let's embarrass Eric a little bit and get into this. Eric and I met a number of years ago, and the reason I want to tell you this is because it's really important. I was working on a campaign for Microsoft of all brands, looking at innovative business leaders, and Eric had just started Method, and Method was this really provocative, interesting new type of brand. And I think fast forwarding a few years, maybe not for you, Eric, but as we all know, Method really changed the game in the CPG world, not only by disrupting a category from out of nowhere, but also, as we see it, disrupting how brands did business inside and out. And after starting Method, Eric went on to disrupt the vitamin and supplement category with OLLY, and even the bandage category with Welly. And what we really love about Eric and the brands that he's created is this hyper attention that I see every time that I talk to him about creativity and design in products, but it also relates to culture and everything a brand does, as Andy sort of mentioned. Eric, thank you so much after all these years for joining us and really always being an inspiration and contributing to the work that we're doing.
No, thanks for having me. And I love the whole brand report. I thought you all did a really, really nice job, and I enjoyed reading it, especially on the other brands.
Great. Well, thank you for your contribution. As I look at you, and we've had a chance to talk before, and I'm really excited for people to hear your point of view, but you've started 4 different brands now, not, in a pretty fast period of time. And so I imagine you have a really great perspective on the state of brands right now. And we'd really just love to hear what you think the state of brands is right now.
Yeah, so I think it's a really great question. Coming off of hopefully the end of the pandemic here, at some point really shook things up in some positive ways and some not so positive ways. And kind of we've talked about before, my imprint on the way I build brands was really formed when I was a planner in advertising, and everything from how culture, design, just how everything comes together. And one of the parts I've been struggling the most with now in this remote, still very hybrid world is how do you build great cultures? Because I'm a huge believer that great brands come from great cultures and branding from the inside out. And the way I think about it is everything is about building this incredible culture, and the products are a souvenir of that culture. So I think in the state of branding, like that part is getting a lot harder right now. We're definitely seeing the business model of D2C brands as digitally native is getting incredibly difficult to build and scale profitable brands. One of the reasons we're building a physical retail store right now. And so I think we're living between these two very different worlds, between physical and digital. And I think at this stage, we thought they were going to kind of come together in a much more cohesive way. And I think it's one of the biggest challenges of building brands right now is juggling those two worlds that have really been just completely shaken upside down from the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I love that idea of physical and digital. I think it's, as you think about, the term that we use, whole brand, when you think about that through the lens of brands in general, what does it make you think of? And, how does that apply to the physical and digital as you're experimenting with that right now?
Yeah, I think we live in an era where it's never been easier to start a brand, but it's never been harder to scale one. And we're living in a much more fragmented, surplus economy. Capital, even though it's getting harder, has been easy. Barriers to entry have gotten significantly easier. And so that's made scaling a lot harder. And so the way I think about it within a physical world is we just continue to see this extreme division between you either win on price and convenience, which can be very well delivered online, not always profitably, or you win on experience. And that's part of what we're trying to build in our retail model is you have to build an experience that's worthy of somebody getting in their car or walking out the door and coming and spend time with you. And that I think is one of the most interesting areas to innovate right now for branding, because physical retail also still allows you to dimensionalize and bring a brand to life in a way that you really can't through any other form.
Love to hear about physical retail. I think that's going to challenge a lot of brands right now. Real quick, before we get on to the other panelists, is there something you could share that's been a common theme with the brands that you've started that is a tool to unite an organization? Is there any, I know it's never a silver bullet, but is there anything you could share with our audience that you kind of swear by when it comes to uniting an organization about a bigger idea?
Yeah, no, you're right. There is no silver bullet. It's 1,000 little touches, and it's the way you cohesively bring it together. And there is no one thing. If there is one thing that I would really argue has been a part of our secret sauce, it's this belief in bringing together artists and operators and making that just really well understood in an organization, that if you want to build one of those few brands that's creative, that's innovative, that's doing really good work, but at the same time runs a great predictable business, you need a team of artists and operators working together under a unified mission.
Of artists and operators. It's something that I wrote down the first time we talked. I love that blend, and I think that's a great thing to go for. Thank you, Eric. We're going to go to our next panelist, and everybody, Eric will be back in a few minutes as we bring all our panelists together. But up next, I would love to introduce Steph Wissink. Steph is a longtime collaborator of Barkley and a contributor to the Whole Brand Project. We've worked on research and initiatives around sustainability, ESG, and purpose. And what we really love about Steph is her unique view of brands from the investment world. And what really makes her special, though, is she's been such a contributor because she has a broad take on what the brands of the future should do and what they shouldn't do. And in this kind of setting, a voice like Steph's isn't usually one we hear about and hear from. And so I love her take on what we're doing with brands. So really excited to hear your thoughts today, Steph. And thank you, as always, for being such a partner of our work.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Tom.
All right. So first up, you come to this discussion representing many brands in your world that are looking to get to another level, to scale up, to secure capital. From that unique vantage point, how do you see the state of brands right now?
Yeah, it's a really interesting time because we're in a backdrop that feels very uncertain, very unpredictable. So we're on the investment side starting to think more about brand equity in a different lens. And I think what you've already heard today is that brands increasingly are safe spaces in a world where things are so unpredictable and so chaotic. Brands can provide those spaces for consumers to come together. We also think about brands as binding agents, community connectors, and creators. They're mediums of self-expression. I just was at Comic-Con San Diego, and I was so overwhelmed by the amount of self-expression that's being delivered through brand and brand adoption. And then I think too, in the spirit of this conversation, brands are becoming guides into new ways of living and thinking, behaving. And that's something new to the investment community, the concept of brand equity and the idea of brands connected to capital as really a way to change living and lifestyles and behavior. And so we're leaning more into that concept. The last thing I would just point out, because I was just listening to the prior panelists talk about the idea of partnership, brands can also be really important conduits of partnership. And that's something that we're looking for more and more on the investment side as well.
I love hearing your view on that, on the investment side and in that community that I think you're in, but not necessarily of. Is everybody asking the right kinds of questions? Or, how often are those equity questions being asked?
Yeah, it's a really good question, very timely. If any of you have opened up your 401k statement recently, you know that the investment industry is in a period of pretty significant performance dislocation. And we tend to have these elevated brand equity conversations during periods of economic expansion when the market is working and we can step away from the rudiments of quarterly performance and really start to think about long-term equity drivers. We're actually on the flip side of that right now. We are hunkered down. COVID has had a real impact on businesses and people, and the investment industry and the stock market is reflecting that. There is this uncertainty around the economy. And as a result, investment fund managers are very focused on performance. They're very focused on the fundamental inputs that denote business health. So that is, how are your sales trending? How are your margins trending? How is your capital structure built? And we're seeing less of a lean into these bigger thematic conversations around brand. Those will return. But as a consequence of the backdrop, we're finding that valuation has gone back into the core academic building blocks of good companies are built on the back of good capital returns. And the great companies, which ultimately have that brand equity that lives on top of it, are trading just like the good companies. So everything is kind of being mashed together at this point, just given the backdrop.
Well, I love hearing that. I guess real quick though, you've seen so much up and down over the last 2.5 years, but still, when you think of whole brands, from your point of view, what else characterizes them? What comes to mind? And what sort of things have you started to look for, maybe that you weren't looking for in the past?
Yeah, I think whole brands to us have one singular commonality, and that's a good, strong compass. Knowing what a brand stands for, what they're willing to step out and represent, how they're willing to use their collateral to connect consumers, and this idea of a hinge at the center of what a brand is willing to lean into and lean out of is a really important topic that we're thinking about. The other thing is that whole brands do prove to be more resilient in times of stress. And we're seeing some of that right now. Consumers are leaning into brands that they trust. They're looking for brands to provide that stability and safety. And so we also see outperformance. The last thing I would just say is we're looking for brands on the risk side that tend to be more transactional in nature. If the whole spirit of a brand is to take advantage of the moment, but not build long-term durability with consumers and repeat purchases and driving sustained growth, that is also a risk. And so there is a separation between whole brands and, let's say, partial brands. Partial brands tend to be very short-term transaction rich. Whole brands tend to be willing to forsake very short-term performance to build long-term durable equity over time.
Thank you. I love that. Yeah, we call them fragmented brands, but I think that is really important. The resiliency, we've seen that in our study as well. Steph, thank you. Again, Steph will be back with us in a few minutes for the full panel. But up next, we have Heidi Hackemer. Heidi is a true whole brand thinker and brings creativity to everything she does. I can promise that, whether it's riding a Harley across the country on her own, or shaking up brands, categories, and even the strategy profession. She's worked as an advisor to the Obama White House, served as a VP of engagement for the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. She's a brave thinker, a self-described truth teller. She has a natural intuition about the world and what's next, and has been instrumental in breaking, changing, and rebuilding systems for the future. It's one of the things I really, really love about Heidi. She served as a trusted advisor and consigliere for some of the world's top brands like Nike and Google, and now one of the most provocative brands out there, Oatly, where she founded and is now leading their climate culture lab, Oatly's future scouting space. Thank you, Heidi, for being with us.
Thanks, Sam. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I had to cut your resume in half just to get that much out there, so thank you.
That intro was ridiculous, but thank you.
Listen, your background is really amazing. You've had some amazing experiences on brands, on big initiatives, and now, driving a lab. From working with all of these and seeing the perspective and the wide range of things, I always love your perspective on brands. How do you see the state of brands right now, the good, bad, and the ugly?
Oh, it's chaos right now. And I think it's chaos in a really exciting way, but also chaos that we have to be respectful of as well. I think this whole backdrop of company conversations, brand conversations, we have the existential crisis of the climate crisis that we're working against. And so in some ways, we're looking to brands of comfort. And I totally agree with that as well. And as they fragment and they get smaller and the communities are driving these brands, there's the safety around brands, which is really lovely and beautiful. And then there's also this questioning of brands, because it is brands and us being sold a lot of crap that we don't need that has gotten us into this place. And so I think we're also seeing this existential questioning of, what is my relationship to brands? What is my relationship to the system that is driving a much bigger issue that we are all feeling? And so I think it's, like I said at the jump, it's a chaotic time, because we have to do all the fundamentals the right way. I agree with so much what was said before me of, like, you have to have that compass. You have to know what you stand for. You have to be able to connect with people and experiences that have real value. I agree with all of that. But then there's also this question of, how should we all be participating in this because of the effects that it's having on our home planet?
That's great. I mean, do you, in that world, we've seen reports on the trust of brands versus the trust of governments and media. Do you look at that as a responsibility and an opportunity? Is that where your world is right now? Or how would you frame that up, the balance of responsibility and opportunity?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, trust will never go away. The need for trust in brands is always going to be there. And I do think that there is a responsibility on the part of companies to lead the way in rethinking about how this whole relationship works. We are seeing, obviously, some movement by government, but government isn't always reliable in these movements. And, give us another election cycle and we'll see what happens, right? But brands, in a weird way, can contribute to a constancy. Their philosophies, their way of operating can actually transcend what governments can bring to the table, which shouldn't work that way. Let me be very clear. I actually, the fastest way to scale, especially in the United States, is government. Actually, government funding can scale ideas in a way that companies never can. But companies have to participate in these longer range points of view because sometimes government doesn't always live up to it. And which is very hard when you're on a quarterly earnings cycle as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is always going to be this barrier that we, especially with whole brand thinking, we have to overcome. Thank you for that. We're going to jump to the panel. Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, Steph. And thank you, Eric. Let's get to the panel. And I want to kind of build on something that Heidi said as we bring everybody in. We are talking about making big moves and big shifts with large organizations and ideas. And one of the things that we really feel strongly about as we think about whole brands is having a core idea and something that lots of people inside and out can rally around. For some, that's a purpose. Some people say North Star. We also use the term red thread. But can you, Heidi and Eric, can you talk to us a little bit about where you've seen those core ideas and those rally cries in the middle, whether you call it purpose or North Star? Can you tell us a little bit about that? And then Steph, we'd love to hear from you. Is that something you look at in the world of equity? Do you look at brands that have a strong central idea?
Like a bond during
Eric, we can start with you if that works.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm suddenly having technical difficulties. Hopefully you can see me okay and hear me fine. Yeah. The rally cry, I've always been a firm believer that, human beings are generally motivated by being part of something bigger than themselves. And it's where I've always found, when we originally started Method, we actually didn't do it. The idea of a social entrepreneur, I don't think even really existed as a concept the way it does today. But we didn't do it because we thought it was what the consumer wanted. We just did it because it was the right thing to do. Like fundamentally, you shouldn't ask somebody to pollute when they clean or use poison to make their homes healthier. And when we created the mission of People Against Dirty, we also discovered that this having a broader social mission was so much more motivating, including ourselves, like wanting to jump out of bed every day to know you're doing something that was bigger than just the pursuit of profit. But then just the entire way that the culture would behave, I found it was not only more motivating, but it also tended to keep politics a little bit more out of it. And also was a way to get people to take kind of bigger risk in their work because it felt like there was a much bigger stake than just the business if we were able to succeed and the ripple effect we would have on the world. So that's really where I learned that at Method and then carried that forward in all the companies that I've started.
Heidi, how about you?
I mean, I think it's absolutely essential. In fact, there's a book that I read, I'm going to date myself now, over 20 years ago when I started out as a brand planner. And it deeply affected the way that I do brand planning. And it's probably one of the only ones it did. It's by Patrick Hanlon, and it's called Primal Brands. And essentially it says that brands are like religious systems. And if you can mimic the religious, the framework of religion in the way that you build a brand, your brand is going to be more successful. And I don't really read a lot of brand books. I don't read a lot of business books, which is probably, shame on me that I don't. But that one book I recommend to everyone. And I think it just echoes what Eric is talking about of it's a system of belief. And we are aligning ourselves around systems of belief. Now, I also think we get a little bit up our own ass on this as well, that we're like, oh, we're creating this amazing system of belief. We're going to save the world. You need that, but you also have to understand that for a lot of people, they don't give a shit about your system of belief as well, right? So I think it's very important for internal culture. I think it's very important for people that are into you and who you are, but never lose sight that 99% of the population probably doesn't care.
Well said.
I think that's great. Yeah, for us, it really comes down to what actually does work. What do people actually care about? Which is great, but I love that. And Heidi, we were 33 minutes in before we had to use the LinkedIn kind of censor button. So thank you. Yeah. Steph, when you look at brands, do you look at, as part of that equity, in the investment community, is that core idea or a purpose? Is that something you measure or look at?
Yeah, and what Heidi just said to me resonated so much because I was at an event maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and a Jewish rabbi was speaking, and this was a brand strategy event. And first and foremost, to see a Jewish rabbi on the agenda was slightly peculiar, but also very intriguing. And he made the same statement that all of the institutions of our world, government, school safety, politics, religion, are collapsing right in front of us. And now is the moment when businesses and brands step in and provide that institutional framework for community. And I thought it was such an interesting take on the role of business. So as we think about brands and business, we absolutely are judging companies through a different lens today. And that extends beyond just capital returns, but also the return on overall people investment and how you're, as an organization, advancing people's awareness of these binding moments. And your brand can actually be a moment in which, or provide a platform in which that religion can form. Certainly that can become somewhat extreme in certain cases, but there is a responsibility among business today to really provide that institutional framework to bring people together. So it definitely resonates, and it's something that it's hard to measure, but ultimately when we look at performance indicators over time, we start to see some commonalities that would indicate that brands have risen up above just pure commerce into community and into institutional types of communities.
That's a great segue. Thanks for that. I think, talking about the religion and, community and doing that kind of work, we wanted to talk a little bit about an ecosystem. When we think about whole brands, and I think this is where, we get frustrated when we see the conversation really being about consumers and products and marketing. And we really look at the whole world. And I think when we think of the ecosystem, we think of sustainability, we think of community, we think of the planet, and we think of people in and around the brands, including employees. I'd love you to talk about your experiences a little bit on that. And how do you see the role of the brand, knowing how many brands we have in the world? How do you see the role of the brand beyond their walls and beyond their category? And if you could share any examples, anything that you're doing, I think would be great. But this seems to be one of the hardest things for brands to see as a responsibility and an opportunity, as we talked about, to step outside of their own sphere.
Yeah, I could jump in. I think the most important part of a brand too is it's not what you say, it's what you do. And for us, that definitely a high watermark in my career. And I don't know if I'll ever have the opportunity to create the same impact, but it was when we were able to scale Method to the point where we could build our own factory. And we wanted that factory to be not only such a reflection of our mission, our values, but really be a catalyst to create better change in the manufacturing sector. So we had this no cornfields rule, because a lot of times you buy cheap farmland and that's where a plant goes. But the problem with that is that's not where the jobs are. So we ultimately chose the inner city of Chicago. We built the first plant in over 40 years on the south side of Chicago. We went and built it, in the neighborhood where the jobs were needed, where we could recruit from the local community. And then everything we did from both a social to environmental. It's got the world's largest rooftop greenhouse on it, operated by Gotham Greens. It's got a wind turbine, solar trees. It achieved, I think still has it, the highest score ever received for LEED certified, and as well as put us at the top of the B Corp scores. But what we were most proud of is when you walked into that facility, there's typically this division of culture of the front office and the factory floor. And if you were there for one of our, we call our summer party, the prom, and if you were there, it was just remarkable. You had, Harvard MBAs with people who had been incarcerated and were second chance. And it was just one culture and one voice. And for us, that was the proudest moment, and giving, upward mobility and opportunities for the people who worked in that plant, as well as then really showcasing the technologies to try to inspire other people. And then it's in Pullman Park, and it helped revitalize the entire area. Whole Foods built a distribution center right behind us. And that's the type of change we want to create. But it wasn't from talking about it. It was just from doing it. And then it made a great, of course, branding moment. We called it the soapbox. And it became a big part of in our advertising campaigns and how we talked about the brand. So selfishly, it did help us as marketers too.
Thanks. I love that story. Heidi, how about you on that note? How can a brand get over feeling like they're just in an insular world where it's just product, customer marketing? How do they get out there and show the responsibility and the opportunity of getting out in the world.
I mean, I couldn't agree more with Eric that it's about action. And that's the whole reason why I started the lab that I started. I really am not interested in writing billboards anymore. I hope I never see a billboard review again for the rest of my career. We have really great people at Oatly do awesome job at that. It doesn't need to be me. And so I really do think that the action lane is super important. And I think it's knowing your lane. So for Oatly, our lane is the food system. It is agriculture. It is all the policy that happens around food. And there's a lot of really messed up policy that you have around food. And so, for example, something that I'm really admire in my European allies is they take on policy in an Oatly way. So, for example, the European Union was about to create this law. It was called A171. And basically, the dairy lobby was lobbying the European Union to say that plant-based milks cannot be in any sort of packaging or have any foods or have any words that say milk. So you couldn't sell a plant-based milk in a carton that looks anything like a milk carton, according to this law, which is because the excuse they were using in their lobbying is that, consumers would get confused. And so my colleagues over in Sweden made this whole campaign called Are You Stupid? And it was basically a bunch of focus groups, and it was putting oat milk in things like detergent containers and, pump bottles, and saying, does it have to be in this for you to understand that it's oat milk? And it was this really brilliant use of what we do, which is, creativity and advertising, but also taking it into the policy space and creating a rallying cry for consumers to be like, this is crazy. And so I think there's a nice blur there between the advertising and the doing. But then I also agree with Eric that the doing has to saturate the entire company. You have to make sure it saturates your operations and your core business. And then in the work that I'm doing now, which I'm really lucky that Oatly sees the value in this, it also is saturating your future scouting and making sure that you are investing in where can the future go and how can we make sure that we continue to build in a way that's aligned with our values while we scale this core business.
I love that future scouting. And that's a great segue to Steph. When you're looking at brands that you want to help scale up, are you looking at their innovation practices? Heidi runs a lab at Oatly. Are you looking at their future scouting, their process for that?
Yeah, for sure. And I want to just double click on something that both Eric and Heidi have said, because I actually have this phrase on my desktop that says, do something, period. Do something that you can do, period. Do something that you can do that matters. And then lastly, do something that you can do that matters, that is material. And this idea of understanding your lane, I think that's so important. We have a lot of companies that we work with that want to change the world. One small company is not going to have the effect. However, one company as part of an alliance that develops something that can be material can be incredibly powerful. So it's the idea of networks and partnerships that are increasingly attractive to us as we evaluate companies. And both of the companies that you have represented here are starters. They're starters of those alliances and those changes. And so that does matter to the financial community. And if it's material, it matters even more. If it can drive outsized performance, if it can drive outsized differentiation, if it can provide depth of brand continuity and attraction, those are all things that will play out in the financial performance of the company. But I do think this idea of doing something that you can do that matters, that is material, is an easy way to think about where those boundary lines should be.
That's great. Thank you. One last question from me, and then I've got some good ones from the audience. We talk a lot about the brand, brand being in a way synonymous with business. And I think that's what whole brands do. They don't just see it as the marketing department. How do you do that inside of an organization? How do you create the mechanization for everyone to own the brand? Can you share a couple things that you do?
Can I jump in, Tim, and I'll share with you from the outside looking in what we look for companies to be doing. Feedback loops are more important than they have ever been. And I think some of the best marketing strategy comes through listening first. And organizations that actually practice listening habits are some of the best performing companies over time. And it starts, of course, with leadership. So we oftentimes will go back and study language that leadership uses. And when you have an executive that understands the concept of we, even just not only philosophically, but in depth, there is a very different output than this idea of a fiefdom or one leader that controls all of the decision making. So we definitely are studying leadership and overall leadership quality differently today. There's diversity, there's equity, there's inclusion, there's markers that the financial community is using to try to put measurement behind some of these things. But when you actually get to the underlying question set, it's really about quality of leadership, quality of culture, and then, as we're talking about today, the durability of that brand. And brands have to evolve. They can't be static. And so I do think there's an element too of, as you're thinking about whole brands that have their own beings. They evolve and graduate and grow and listen through feedback loops and change to what the consumer's needs are as those need states change.
Yeah, could not agree more. And I could completely geek out on how do you build an organization around creating a whole brand. And what I've done is, again, I try to make everybody understand, like, we all own the brand, like, not marketing. And I've even segmented the way I split up marketing. So when I build a leadership team, the brand lives everywhere. So for example, obviously the head of product, like, the product is the most, I would argue, most important brand mark and brand expression. Sales, the way it's presented to the consumer in a store, online, really important. But what I did is, very early on, started this method. I broke up the marketing function. And my theory was, like, marketing communications moves too fast today, and it's too fragmented for the traditional brand manager who really, the P&L was a media spend. That world doesn't exist anymore. And those people are almost too valuable also not to be focused on running the broader P&L and really operating as mini CEOs. So I split it up where marketing lives with kind of 3 different people on the leadership team. It lives with the person who runs marketing communications, and that's all they're focused on, is how we express the brand through marketing. A creative director who is at a peer to everybody else. And I always put creative on the leadership team and believe that creative should drive strategy as much as strategy drives creative. And when you do that, you just get into a state of make so much faster, and you get out of PowerPoint hell where you, like, argue over bullet points versus, like, no, let's actually look at the work. And then I take what was kind of half the brand management function and set them up as business directors. Like, they're really on a CEO path versus a CMO path, and they own consumer insight. They're responsible for helping to bring all the pieces together across product, brand, sales, and really serve kind of as more of a general manager. And then again, finance, HR, which we call people and environment. Everybody is just completely aligned that, ultimately the only thing we own of value is our brand, and that has to be a holistic experience inside and out.
That's great. Thank you, Eric. I think, Heidi, do you want to add to that one?
Just to say that, like, when my boss, John Schoolcraft, entered Oatly in 2014, he blew up the marketing department and said that it just is the antithesis of great branding, and instead started the Oatly Department of Mind Control, which was our creative team, which our job as ODMC, I used to run ODMC in North America before I took on my new role. And our job then was we were forced to embed in the organization, really understand the business, really understand what's going on. And then we would go and brief ourselves and create the work that we thought was the best work, knowing what's going on with the business, and would approve our own work and then do our own work. So we cut out the briefing and approval loops, but instead made sure that ODMC saturated the entire organization, extracting what was needed for ODMC to do what they do, but also in that saturation, making sure that the brand was infusing all the departments in the organization at the same time. And I know that's kind of a radical way of doing it. I know that most companies aren't going to blow up their marketing department. I understand that. But I do think it's really interesting how Oatly went from this, like, crunchy, horrific, like, small, I mean, Oatly's been around since the 90s, right? And it was just sitting on dusty shelves in Swedish natural food stores until 2014, when the creatives took over. And then you just see this stratospheric growth of the company. So I think there's something to that.
So what if we put that on a billboard when the creatives took over, and what Eric said, creative before strategy? Would you be okay with a billboard if that's what it said?
Honestly, I don't care. Just put whatever you want on the billboard.
Okay, because we're going to have a lot of people that want to see that part of this conversation, which I love about both of you. Thank you so much. We've got time for a couple quick questions, and then some final words from the 3 of you. One of them, there's been a lot of interest, Eric, around the comment you made about the artist and the operator. So can you talk to us a little bit more about how you mechanize that? And is it separate people? Are you bringing in contrasting people? Or do you build teams that way?
Let's try this without mute.
There you go.
I think when you look at some of the most successful brands in history, they really had an artist and operator at the top. So like Gap in its heyday, between Mickey Drexler, who is the artist, and Don Fisher, even though he's the founder, was the operator, or Tim Cook and Steve Jobs. And so I try to create that at the top. And that, for me, that really starts also with, like, if I'm the CEO, I'll bring in a really strong COO who's a great operator. And that frees me up to be a little bit more on the artistry side. And again, how I build out the leadership team, but at the heart of it is having that at the top. It's putting a creative director as a leader in the business, not letting it get buried as creative services. I mean, that is the most important part. That's what the consumer experience is. And then bringing as much in-house as we can as soon as possible of the people who are creating what a consumer experiences, whether that's the product, the brand. So we bring in industrial design, graphic design, full creative team, fragrance, flavor, based on what we're doing, and really having those creators in-house, because otherwise you kind of outsource your soul. And if you look at the Apples and the Nikes of the world, the reason I think there's such strong trend leaders is because majority of that is really done in-house. And then when you've got, I remember Andy Spade said to me years ago, when you bring creative in-house, it just gets so fun. And it's true.
I love that. Anybody else want to comment on that or take another question? Okay, next one really is, if based on what we're talking about, the brands that I imagine you all want to see in the world, if you had to kind of say the number one barrier, what's the number one barrier to creating a whole brand? Heidi, you want to try that one first?
Fear. People are afraid of change, and a whole brand approach is a different way of doing things. I think that's true of everything we're facing right now. We have to rethink the way systems are working. We have to rethink the way brands are working. We have to rethink the way we as individuals are relating. And that's scary because it's change. So I always think that I always take it down to fear. I always feel like fear is like the world's biggest barrier, and we have to examine our own fears in these processes and do our best to overcome them.
And does compelling data overcome fear?
Depends on your brain. For me, no, not really. I mean, no, don't get me wrong. I love data. The data comes in many different forms, but I think actually the fastest way to get people to overcome fear is to tell a really great story.
Great.
And then, make sure there's data underneath it. But storytelling is how we move. It's always how we've always moved. It's how we always will move. It is what we are as a species.
Yeah, I think everybody forgets that the power of storytelling is the most way to influence between humans, and that's such a lost art in leadership. That's so important.
And I would add to that. Yeah, I would just add to that small victories matter in a big way right now. And if you can motivate your team to have a small win, that can start a really important process of big wins down the road.
That's great. Last one here is really, how do you balance the short-term gains versus the long-term foundational strategies? Any recommendations there? Because we struggle with that, and I think that's where obviously the marketing and the quarterly sales cycles come in. But any other tips on managing short-term and long-term?
Maybe, Tim, I'll jump in here just because I want to ground this idea of the macro that we're in. The reality is, if you look over very long durations, out of every 10 years, there are 2 years that are challenging and 8 years that are wonderful. And so for companies today, it's really about getting through these next 2 years. And yes, you're going to have a short-term mindset around capital protection, around transparency and agility and seeking truth and stabilizing your business. But there are better days to come, and they're not that far away. And so being able to put your practices in place today, so when the growth does come, you're ready to run after it and chase it. Those are incredibly important markers for us on the financial side to make sure that companies aren't losing sight of that North Star. And I think that's one of the things from a financial community perspective that we could do a better job of, is to understand that in moments of stress, financial stress, capitalism stress, business stress, that there are still small wins and there are still green shoots of things that are happening, and the consumer expects there to still be progress, even when it feels like things are stalling from a financial perspective.
I love that. I'm going to steal that from you, the two versus 8 too, because it's like in June when everything started to unwind, I was amazed at like how quickly everybody brought the oars in the boat and just kind of froze. I'm like, are you kidding? Like, this is when we plant seeds, and this is when we start building. So when we get back into the better cycle, we're in a position to take advantage of it. The psyche of it's just incredible.
Yeah, I think with the three of you, I mean, in your experiences and your perspectives, I think there's a book deal that we need to negotiate right now, because your perspectives are provocative and smart, and you've proven it, which is really great. So listen, we're about at time, and we've talked a lot about language, and we did at the beginning, and I firmly believe, and I think we firmly believe in storytelling, and that the words we use can shape our reality. So we'd love to just end with a couple, 1 word, 2 words. Heidi, you mentioned fear, but we'd love to just end with a couple words from each of you before we wrap things up, as a parting shot. So Eric, do you mind starting us off?
Yeah, no problem. For me, I think right now I've been playing with these words of art and grit. And it's the art for me is the creativity and the innovation, the design, and the way that you really engage a consumer emotionally, which is more important than ever. And then the grit is a little what we talked about, the cycle we're in to apply the hard work. And again, I think if you look at any successful, even, artist, regardless of performing art or an actor or musician, like they have that combination of incredibly talented on the creative side and the art piece of it, but then the grit to build it and keep going, particularly when things get hard. So for me right now, it's art and grit.
Love that. Thank you. Steph?
Yeah, I think 2 things that jumped out at me are perspective and partnership. And having good perspective to be able to step back and know that there is a future better reality, and seeking partners. And that not only means strategic partners, but it also can mean just strong advisors into your network to help guide you through a period that feels very uncertain.
Thank you for that. All right, Heidi, you get the last word.
The 2 words I've really been thinking a lot about lately are resilience and joy. I find that we have to maintain our resilience as individuals, as companies, as societies, which is hard. It's very, very hard right now. In light of trying to solve a lot of really big problems, it's hard to stay resilient. And I've learned a lot by being around, very luckily, being able to be around Indigenous communities where they are really intentional, about cultivating joy, and how joy is actually the way that we stay resilient. And if we get too serious, and if we get too caught up in the problems, and we forget that there is beauty, there is joy, there are things that we need to believe in, and there's ways that we need to connect with one another, then that's when it all goes south. That's when it fails. So I've really tried to, in my own life and in my teams and in the work that I'm doing, remember to say to myself, where's the joy? Are we having fun? And that's something, those 2 words, resilience and joy, are the ones that I've been focusing on.
Thank you. Well, you 3 bring me a lot of joy and inspiration, and thank you so much for joining us. And thanks to my Barkley team, the whole brand project team, and to our audience for joining us in our first live performance of our report. Please make sure to get a deeper dive and download the report if you haven't gotten it. We believe firmly, and I think with my 3 contributors here, that brands can and should add good to the world, but they can't do that if they're fragmented. They can't add to culture, they can't add to community, and they can't definitely add to the planet. So with that said, may the most whole brands win, and have a great day. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.